Hello, hello. I can see people entering the room, so let's give ourselves a little bit of time so that everybody can join us. And I can see hellos and welcomes in the chat from different parts of the world. Okay, people are still entering, so I'm going to wait another couple of minutes before I start. It's lovely to see so many people who are able to join us today. Hello to everybody. We're still waiting for people to enter the room. And I think I'll start in about a minute. And hopefully by then everybody will be already in the room. It's lovely to see people saying hello from so many different places. Okay, so let's give ourselves another 20 seconds and we will be starting soon. Okay, I think probably most of the people have managed to enter the room. So I suggest that we start. So once again, a very warm welcome. Hello, everybody. My name is Ania Kolbuszewska, and today in my session, I'm going to talk about standing out in the crowd. Now, in the last couple of years, and especially after the pandemic hit the world, we have started hearing and seeing this term that you can see on the screen, VUCA, more and more to describe the world that we live in now. Now, as most of you probably know, VUCA is actually an acronym, and this is an acronym for the following words: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Words which seem to be a really accurate description of what is around us, of the environment that we have to function in. Now, what you may not know is that VUCA is in fact a term which comes from military and which describes the reality of war, where soldiers have their aims, but they cannot plan long term because they cannot predict what will happen. But what is important is that they can really observe the reality around them and to react to it. Now, or these days, the term VUCA is used a lot in the context of business and in the context of management, but also in the context of personal development. And we know that the world will never be a comfy place it used to be. We have been forced to get out of our comfort zone and learn to deal with the uncertainty, ambiguity, volatility, complexity. The message, in fact, is very simple. We cannot relax because we don't know what is going to happen. So how do we deal with the fact that we live in the VUCA reality, that we have to keep getting out of our comfort zone? Dealing with the VUCA reality requires, first of all, that we are flexible and adaptable, and that we should not be afraid of being flexible and adaptable. And this naturally means constant learning and a creative approach to issues. And this brings me to something that we are all familiar with, notably the work of a psychologist, Carol Dweck from Stanford University, who came up with two terms, and again, I'm sure you know these terms: fixed mindset and growth mindset. So let's have a very brief look at these two mindsets. If you are the person with a fixed mindset, then you believe that your intelligence, your personality, your character are unchangeable. They are fixed. And your potential is actually determined at the very beginning of your life, and it can never change. By contrast, if you have a growth mindset, you believe that your intelligence, personality, character can be continuously developed, and your true potential is in fact unknown because you can learn and grow. So if we look at certain characteristics of the fixed and the growth mindset, if you have a fixed mindset, then you try to avoid failure, but growth mindset, you're not afraid to fail because failure is a way to learn. If you have a fixed mindset, you want to look smart. Growth mindset, you want to learn continuously. Fixed mindset, you avoid challenges. Growth mindset, you embrace challenges. Again, because challenges are learning experiences. People with a fixed mindset stick to what they know, but people with a growth mindset put a lot of effort into learning new things. People with a fixed mindset take feedback personally, and people with a growth mindset really want feedback on current state, because again, it allows them to learn and to develop. And finally, people with a fixed mindset avoid uncertainty, but people with a growth mindset confront uncertainty. And this takes us back to dealing with the VUCA reality. So let me introduce to you a concept of dilemma flipping. Now, this interesting approach to reality has been suggested by a noted futurist, Bob Johansen, in his book, Leaders Make the Future, 10 New Leadership Skills for an Uncertain World. Now, in ELT, we are, of course, familiar with the term flipping. And of course, the flipped classroom is a concept where you change where the different stages of the learning process happen. So we deal with input before the lesson, with students, for example, watching educational videos or reading background information. Then in class, we have space and time for practicing skills. And finally, we of course provide students with some form of extension for the work that has been done so far. And this is again done out of class. So this is flipping in the context of ELT or generally in education. Now here, what Johansen means by flipping dilemmas is turning problems that can't be solved into opportunities. And what he suggests is changing the words which stand behind the acronym VUCA. And just as a quick reminder, VUCA means volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So he suggests changing or flipping those words into different concepts. So vision replaces volatility. According to Johansen, it's crucial for an organization to have a vision, especially in very turbulent times. Understanding replaces uncertainty. Organizations which have excellent communication strategies have a very high chance of carrying out the vision that we have just mentioned, and that we said is so important, especially in turbulent times. So first of all, have a vision, and then have excellent communication strategies and be able to communicate the vision that you have as an organization. And then we've got clarity instead of complexity. Managers need current and accurate information about what happens in their organizations in order to make appropriate decisions quickly and flexibly. And that means transparency or clarity throughout the organization. And finally, agility to replace ambiguity. Johansen indicates that organizations need to be able to adapt quickly and to introduce changes across the organization quickly. Now, perhaps when we're talking about the future, it would actually be quite helpful to look back at the past and at how our own understanding of the industry and its place in the economy has changed in this part of the world that we come from. The 1990s were really good for private language schools. Growth was taken for granted. It was obvious. Demand was soaring. And it seemed that private language schools were unshakable. everyone wanted to set up a language school, a private language school, because it was such a good business. I personally still remember times at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s where all places on all courses would sell within the first 24 hours of starting the September registration. Now, the first real signs of trouble came around mid-2000s, when all of a sudden there was no growth year to year, and worse, a decrease in client numbers started. And sometimes, in fact, it resembled a terrifying waterfall, with some private language schools losing 50% year to year. The second decade of our century has brought a little stability, which obviously was very welcome, with big chains of language schools, as well as small and very flexible language teaching operations coming out victorious after the crisis. The young learners market has been doing relatively well, although nowhere near as well as in the 1990s and at the beginning of the 2000s. The adult learners market has changed quite considerably, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, this timeline has, of course, had some variations across the region, but the trends have been very, very similar. In 2015, I was doing a training session for managers in private language schools, in which we actually looked at market trends, which by then had already started shaping the industry. Now, the points that, or the trends that we identified were these: increased demand for quality, increased pressure on cost, very fragmented market, so huge competition from a number of sometimes very small enterprises. The location of the service provider was very important at the time. Individualization and flexibility of learning and teaching was something that was being very much in demand. And finally, a trend that nobody could ignore, and that was globalization and technological advances. So the development of online teaching was already underway in those days. Now, when we look at these points now, some of them are still relevant, but some have become rather irrelevant, like, for example, the location of the service provider. And that is because of the globalization and technological advances. Fragmentation of the market is, of course, an issue, but it seems much more relevant to look at the global market rather than the local market, because we have actually started competing globally rather than locally. And among the most relevant points, or the most relevant issues, are definitely demand for quality, which needs to be balanced out with a huge pressure on cost. And I don't need to tell you how difficult it is to balance these two out. So what exactly is quality? Well, quality in the service sector is the ability to provide a service at an appropriately high level, time and time again. So if you look at this definition of quality in the service sector, there are two key concepts or key issues in this definition. And the first one is that quality means not going below a certain level. Now, of course, we need to think about how to define that certain level, but we'll talk about it in just a moment. So that's the first key point. And the second key point is repetitiveness. In other words, you need to be able to provide good quality service time and time again. You need to be able to repeat the same quality of service. Now, language schools are, of course, part of a service sector. And to be more exact, we sell intangible services. And this means that in contrast to, for example, selling TV sets, language schools sell something that can only be described as a cat in a bag. And this, of course, has implications for quality, which in this service sector is customer-led, And that means meeting and even preventing, exceeding, not preventing. So meeting or exceeding customer expectations. So this is how we actually define the appropriate level of service, through customer expectations. So quality is customer-led. And also it means preventing problems rather than repairing. And that means through focus on processes, through attention to processes as a way of building quality and as a way of preventing problems rather than repairing after the fact. Why is it so important to prevent problems? Because if you keep putting out fires instead of preventing them, you are no longer a language school, you are a fire brigade. Now, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the concept of a customer journey and customer journey mapping. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but this is, of course, very closely connected with the point that I would like you to focus on, and that is attention to processes, which we mentioned literally a couple of seconds ago. So what you can see on the screen at the moment is an example customer journey map, which shows kind of typical stages of a process of taking a decision to enroll on, for example, a language course. And this map is in fact a mix of digital and physical customer touchpoints. And of course, customer touchpoints are those moments when the customer comes in direct contact with your company in digital form, such as, for example, your website, where the customers, for example, register online, or in a physical form, such as a brochure or a magazine article about your language school. Now, one of the ways in which we can actually bring the cat out of the bag is by telling the clients what they can expect from the service that we provide to them. And a big part of this is, of course, academic management. Academic management is at the very core of a language teaching operation. When we think about academic management, we think about things such as course design. So the whole concept of curriculum, syllabi, planning at lower levels, such as, for example, weeks or individual lessons, which should fit in with the overall course program. We also think about things such as testing and assessment, including, of course, placement testing and progress assessment throughout the course, but also proficiency assessment. So, for example, external exams. Then we have, of course, teaching and learning resources and how easily accessible they are for teachers and for the learners. And of course, this whole huge area of teacher support and teacher development. Now, we're going to have a closer look at each one of those elements of academic management in this new reality that we function in. But before we do, we need to go back to customer expectations and to look at what these expectations are today in the post-pandemic world of such high uncertainty. So what is it that our clients expect in this complicated reality that we live in? Well, first of all, the English language teaching market needs to respond to a much wider trend of increased personalization and customization of products and services. Adult learners want a more flexible, individualized product, which is focused on their needs and which actually fits in with their busy lives. So the days of offering standard general English group courses as the core of your business seem to be coming to an end. Now, this does not mean that there is no demand for these. It's just that this demand is rapidly going down, and the demand for personalized, tailor-made training is rapidly increasing, with more and more clients demanding one-to-one rather than group training. With this, there is, of course, pressure on speed, on fast results. and consequently on length of training provided, with short, often modular courses on the rise. And this, of course, forces speed of academic management solutions. Another aspect is the rise of specialized training and the fact that learners expect to have control over their own learning, so learner independence. In short, adult customers want simplicity in terms of admin and academic solutions. They don't want a high-level long-term commitment, hence shorter courses. They want to be challenged but not stressed. We have sufficient levels of stress around us. And one factor creating stress is not enough face-to-face time with other people. And our clients crave that connection now, but only if it doesn't inconvenience them too much, of course. So if we look at these customer expectations, it seems that we have a kind of a major tug of war here. Clients want quality, but they don't want to spend too much money on improving quality, because then the courses will be more expensive, but also schools don't want to spend too much money on improving quality because their business will not be viable. Clients want individualized, tailor-made solutions, but they won't pay a high price for these solutions because there is a very high level of competition. Do you remember we mentioned fragmented market? And the client can always threaten to choose your competitor. And in the days of online learning and teaching, this may actually mean choosing a provider at the other end of the globe. Clients expect sound academic management, but again, there's strong pressure on time. They want human connection, they want focus on well-being, but they want convenience, hence hybrid solutions are so popular at the moment. They want faster service, but again, there is a pressure on quality. They want flexibility, but flexibility generally requires resources on standby, which is, of course, expensive, and customers are not prepared to pay for it. Customers want to learn language as a tool and to develop it over time, but at the same time, they pressurize us for fast results. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the US market, research shows very clearly that 35% of students in the US are considering voting with their feet and moving to lower cost, but more technologically savvy institutions. And to add insult to injury, we know, among others from research which has been carried out by the British Council, that the numbers of learners of English are falling. And the key findings in the British Council report show very clearly and very unambiguously we should expect lower numbers in terms of customers for our courses. And no, it doesn't look like a dramatic drop, but it is enough of a drop to cause concern. But there is, of course, good news as well. The future demand for English in Europe will decrease in terms of numbers of learners and the proportion of adult learners who want to learn only in a classroom setting. But this is counterbalanced by an increase in demand from learners who want to improve their proficiency through a blend of self-directed learning and shorter but intensive courses which have a face-to-face component. Okay, so we've had a bit of a bitter reality check. But that provides us with a background to what needs to be done. And this takes us back to academic management. One of the elements of academic management, as we have already said, is teacher development, and in more general terms, teacher support, of course. Teacher support really needs to focus now on these areas which have become crucial because of how education is changing. First of all, recent developments have forced us to redefine the role of the teacher and the role of the student. You may remember we have already mentioned that students want more control over their own learning. They want more learner independence. The second thing is that the hybrid model, which is going to stay with us for a number of reasons, which some of them we have already mentioned, and this model creates challenges both on the level of planning and of teaching itself. There is, of course, a need for multitasking on the part of the teacher and for keeping all learners engaged, and also balancing the split of teacher attention. And if we're talking about this, we need to remember that hybrid teaching will always produce some pedagogical tensions as well. What I mean by this is that the pedagogy which is aimed at facilitating, for example, online discussions, so for example, checking the answers given by the students in the chat, or waiting for students to respond in the chat, these features or this way of doing things in the classroom will annoy students in the physical classroom. But on the other hand, the pedagogy which is aimed at the in-person students, so those who are in the physical classroom, so for example, writing on the board, calling on the student who is out of the microphone's range, that will annoy the remote students. But that means that the teacher support that we provide in language teaching operations needs to focus on the following elements: classroom management, lesson planning, and course planning, of course. But very often course planning is not on the part of the teacher, it's not the responsibility of the teacher, it's the responsibility of the institution or the academic management of the institution. And the third area that we need to focus on is, of course, IT skills, or more generally, digital literacy of both teachers and students. You may be aware that last year, the European Centre for Modern Languages conducted a survey in language teaching industry, and the survey has been so far the biggest survey of its kind. And it really confirmed the need for a considerable increase in professional development programs. But it also noted that the new context and the changes brought about by the pandemic have all created a platform for the improvement of teaching in general. In other words, the enormous amount of work which we have all put into adapting the teaching learning process to the needs of the pandemic reality will not be lost, and that any changes in language education in the future will most definitely take account of the experience of the pandemic. Okay, so we have looked at teacher support as one of the crucial elements of the academic management processes, but it would be a bit foolish to disregard equally important areas such as course design or assessment, which is, of course, very closely connected with course design. So we need to look at these two areas in the context of new customer expectations, and that's value for money, low commitment, meaning short courses, and fast and efficient service. When talking about customer journey for language teaching operations, one of the moments when the customer comes into contact with the language school is, of course, when they are placement tested. Now, given all of the issues that we have discussed so far, we need a solution for placement testing, which is cost effective, which does not engage staff too much or at all, because of course, time staff spend on placement testing is money. And it should also cover on all levels so that the school does not have to make decisions, but those decisions are made automatically. But we also need a solution which is convenient for students or for the clients, so they can do the test wherever they want. They can do it online from home or from work, or they can do it on site. Now, placement is something that's inherently connected with course design and delivery. And I would like us now to have a look at how benchmark testing, which is linked very closely to placement assessment, makes this link between what students need to learn and English courseware. Now, in placement and benchmark testing, students' results are presented both as each individual student's achievements, but also as group results. And when you get a detailed analysis of individual students' results, as well as the analysis of the whole group of students, you also get very clear information on what course of study these particular students individually, but also as a group, need. So let's make this section a little bit bigger so that you can see the recommendations and suggestions that you get and which are based on results of testing. And let me also draw your attention to one more detail here, and that's mapping to courseware, mapping to course books, in other words. So let's make this section a little bigger as well. And also I'd like to draw your attention to another little part of that, little only graphically, but actually quite important, because you are also here able to choose the course book that you're using, and you will be provided with suggestions on what this particular course book or how this particular course book is going to be useful to students based on their test results. And of course, there are different versions for adults and for young learners, but the principle is basically the same. You get a solution which is suitable for today's reality on many different levels. And most important, it's a solution which makes your life easier, and it makes the lives of your teachers easier. Now, why am I so hung up on this? Well, because we've all gone through some really tough times, and we all deserve to experience changes which are not causing stress and rejection. Just as a practical piece of information, the benchmark test for young learners can also be accessed as an app, which is something that you would kind of expect, because this is what our young learners will probably want a lot more than any other form of communication. And because we're talking about young learners, there is naturally a guide for parents of those young learners who will be taking the benchmark test in this particular app. And one of the trends in our industry, which we have already mentioned, is a very strong push towards individualization. And this is also where the benchmark test will help. Traditionally, you would give the same test to all students in a group, maybe two different versions of the test, but the test would be at the same level. With benchmark test, you can actually select different level tests for individual students. And then that provides you and the students with individualized learning paths. Now, I would like us to go back in time a little bit. In fact, I'd like us to go back about 2 years, because it's just over 2 years since World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Online and hybrid classrooms have dominated education over the past years because of the pandemic. And the pandemic has had a huge effect generally on our lives, not just on education. And there's of course no point in talking about it because we all know it. One of the most common effects has been elevated levels of stress. And this is true for practically everybody, teachers and students included. And so right now, stress is really the last thing that we want or need. And it is the last thing that we want or need because we have all worked so hard to respond to the pandemic challenge. And you will probably recognize the response of your own organization in the stages which have been identified as stages of response to the COVID-19 pandemic in the report, which you can see on the screen. And the first stage was emergency response. And this was, of course, a move to remote or online learning, in many cases, literally overnight, and of course, largely facilitated through online platforms such as Zoom or Teams. So that was the first stage of our response. The second was creativity and innovation. As teachers and institutions became more familiar with the basic functionality of online platforms, we saw a much broader use of the available technology in very creative and very innovative ways. And finally, consolidation and future-proofing. And this is the stage of reflecting on what has worked well and what we want to keep after we have returned to the face-to-face classroom, or after we will have returned to face-to-face classrooms, depending, of course, on what the situation in your context is. Now, we said earlier that in order to survive and prosper in the VUCA world, we need to be adaptable. We need to be able to implement frequent change. After all, it was already Charles Darwin who knew this to be true. It's not the strongest who survive. It's not the most intelligent. It's those who are not afraid of change, but can accept it as the only constant in life. Now, in the past years, we've been responding to change all the time. And news alert, it's not going to be different from now on. Gone are the days of safety and security and having the same business models for 30 years. But of course, change brings about a set of its own challenges, which we need to be aware of. Now, some of you may be familiar with the metaphor of the rider and the elephant, which basically explains why, regardless of how neutral change may be, the way we react to it is always personal or emotional. Now, the rider and the elephant represent two parts of our minds. The rider represents the rational, the logical part of our brain, of our mind. The elephant, on the other hand, represents our emotions, our gut response. Now, of course, it's the rider who decides on the direction that he or she wants to go and sets off. But it is the elephant, that the emotional side, that's providing the power. That's the engine, basically. And the rider can try to direct the elephant, of course, but if there is any disagreement between the rider and the elephant, it's the elephant which is going to win because it has an advantage of many tons. Now, in order to understand how the elephant, meaning our emotions, work, we need to have a look at something which is called the change curve. And the change curve is a diagram. And this diagram represents what stages we go through when we are confronted with changes. And it doesn't matter what kind of change we are confronted with. This is a very universal type of response. So we've got two axes on this diagram. We've got the axis of time and the axis of performance. In other words, the change curve shows how our performance changes in time when we are confronted with changes. And this is what the change curve looks like. In other words, it goes down before it can go up. And the stages that we generally go through are shock, denial, blame, anger, uncertainty, and only after a considerable amount of time do we reach acceptance. And once we have reached acceptance, we can start planning and we can start action. Now, wouldn't it be easier if we had our desired outcome, the result of the change, and if we just plotted a simple direct line from the starting point to the desired outcome? That would make everyone's lives so much easier. But we might be forgetting about something. We might be forgetting the elephant, which weighs 6 tons and which will inevitably pull my beautifully designed straight route to the shape of the classic change curve. We can ignore people's emotions if we want, but we do it at our own danger, because emotions are always going to accompany change processes. And if we disregard them, we'll have a catastrophe on our hands. Now, you'll probably recognize the Nobel Prize winner, American poet and social activist Maya Angelou. And she has actually said something like this. And of course, what she's talking about is the elephant, our emotions. Now, we don't really have time to look in great detail at what you can do to implement change successfully. We'll just mention a couple more issues connected with change. So I'd just like to refer you to my change management guru, John Cotter, and this highly entertaining book that he has co-written, Our Iceberg is Melting. Some of you have probably read this book. For those of you who haven't, it's a really well-written story about a colony of penguins who are forced to look for a new home because environmental changes have made the current iceberg dangerous to live on. So in other words, it's a book about change, but told through a story about a colony of penguins. Now, one of the most common emotions which are related to the process of change is fear. We are all afraid of something, and mostly change is resisted because people are afraid. And what it is that they are afraid is the new. We are afraid of the new. And this is, of course, true for both teachers and students. And the technological revolution is happening at such enormous speed that it really leaves us all breathless. Both students and teachers need to learn on the fly to cope with the educational technology. And that is on top of all the other stressors that we have these days. Now, if we're talking about managing complex change, in order to be able to implement change, you need a number of different elements. So you need a vision, you need skills within your staff, you need incentives that you provide as management, you need resources, and of course you need an action plan. So what happens if one of these elements is missing? Well, if the vision is missing, then what we have is confusion. If the skills are missing, what we have is anxiety. And we're going back to the fear that we have talked about. If incentives are missing, then we have resistance. If resources are missing, then we have frustration. And finally, if there is no action plan, so good intentions but no action plan, we've got a lot of false starts. So in other words, to implement complex change, we need all of these elements together. So once again, don't forget about the elephant, and don't assume that people, whether we're talking about teachers or students, will be able to deal with this very emotionally difficult situation of change on their own. And this really brings me to the issue of well-being, which, as we all know, has become very, very important in recent years. Now, what you can see on the screen is an article which I would really like to recommend, and it's an article which discusses how empathy has become the most important leadership skill. So let's go back to academic management, the management of the core activities in the language teaching organization. So we have looked at the area of teacher support. We have started looking at course design and how this is linked to professional, cost and time-effective placement, which is supported by benchmark testing. And of course, a very important part of our operations is not only placement testing, but assessment in general. And we have already mentioned how benchmark assessment helps map students' results to courseware. And this is all very good and well, but one of the things which is definitely not disappearing from the English language teaching landscape is external objective testing. And this needs to be part of a coherent system, which provides both the language school and the clients of the school with a perfect combination of learning resources and assessment solutions for different stages of the customer learning journey. And so for a successful learning journey, what both the schools and the clients need is a combination of accurate placement testing, learning resources for various stages of the learner's journey, which guarantee effective and relevant learning for students, and also tracking students' progress, and all that ensuring continuous development towards the final success in external exams. We all know that gaining a certificate for many of our clients is only a step on a learning journey. But of course, gaining a certificate in an international exam is a huge achievement and it should be celebrated. But what we also want for our clients is to be able to tell them where to go next. In other words, we want to be able to generate an accurate and helpful map for our client of where they should go next. And here you can actually see a report, and let me make part of it a little bit bigger. You can see that it can be downloaded as a PDF. And it's here, in this case, is based on the coursebook Business Partner, which the student was actually using. So let's go back to the customer journey. Paradoxically, one of the most important customer touch points is what we do for the client after they have completed a course with us. Hence the importance of showing them where they can go next, even if they don't go there with us. So excellent post-sale service is what causes clients to come back or to recommend the service to someone else. And we know that word of mouth is one of the most powerful marketing mechanisms in our industry. Now, in the past hour or so, we have talked about a range of issues which are relevant to the survival and success of language schools in this really complex and unpredictable reality that we live in. So just very quickly to bring the most important points together, what is it that will make your language school stand out from the crowd? Well, first of all, it's access to a tailored digital product suite. It's also access to a complete blend of print and digital materials for all age groups and for all learning and teaching scenarios. Of course, smooth implementation of the course books, mapped using the coherent assessment tools. A combination of learning resources and tests for various stages of the learner's journey. And through that, providing a very complete learning experience for your clients. Now, I wonder if it's coincidence that when we're talking about completeness in terms of a learning experience, we are in fact, you may not realize this, but we are in fact also talking about one of the 7 elements of effective communication. Well, after all, communication is our daily bread. So what, apart from completeness, are the other C's of effective communication? Conciseness, consideration, concreteness, clarity, courtesy, and correctness. This is just a little aside. Another aside, which actually is connected with what we're talking about, are some quotes from teachers and students about what completeness means. And these come from an Outbooks book on completeness. And the first quote is this: "I think that is something that has nothing missing." Completeness is when something has all its parts working well, nothing is missing. A puzzle is complete when all its parts are united and convey an image. And when you think about how important completeness is in ensuring a positive experience, then everything that we have talked about today about different elements of a coherent system, all that falls into place like pieces of a puzzle. And this is, in fact, one of the ways of future-proofing your organization. Now, future-proofing is a term which has become very popular in the last years because, of course, we live in the VUCA world. And this is a real balancing act and often feels like tightrope walking. So one of the ways of future-proofing your organization is adopting solutions which are holistic and which at the same time meet customer expectations in terms of speed, price, flexibility, individualization, and at the same time providing the kind of support that your staff need to face the VUCA challenge. I would also like to give you some other ideas about how you can work on future-proofing your organization by involving all your staff, not only teachers. One of the ways of future-proofing your organization through involving the whole team is an activity which is essentially scenario planning. So in essence, this is storytelling about the future. Now, for this activity to really work well, you need teams which are as diverse as possible. So, for example, you might have a teacher, a receptionist, a sales officer, a marketing officer working together in one team. And the task that you give each team is exactly the same. You are, in the year 2027, tell a story about what has happened in the last 5 years, so between 2022 and 2027. The idea in this exercise is this. First of all, we all love stories, and it's so much easier for us to talk about things if we tell stories. Secondly, and this is extremely important, people will have very different stories to tell. And it's really important that within your organization, everybody is aware that people have sometimes very different visions of the future. Another activity I'd like to suggest is in fact an activity which was first put forward by Adrian Underhill and which kind of looks into this idea of diversifying your business and brainstorming alternative ideas for your business. And the idea is in fact extremely simple. You take a sentence which summarizes what is the core of your activity. For example, we sell English courses to adult students in Poznan. And Poznan is my city. So you then start substituting words in this sentence one by one. So for example, the first person or the first team, you can do it either person by person or team by team, could change the sentence to, we sell English courses to adult students online, or we sell German courses. We sell German courses to young students online. We sell pronunciation courses to young students online. Now, remember that this is not an activity where you are focused on producing the next big thing, but but rather on becoming unstuck in your way of thinking about your business. And finally, an activity again for the whole staff, but preferably again in small and diverse teams. And this activity is called SCAMPER. Some of you probably will probably know this activity, and perhaps you have already used it. If not, again, this is an activity, as I said, to be done in teams. And in those teams, you try to identify those elements in your organization which can be substituted, replaced, in other words. Just to give you an example from a completely different industry, if you are making windows for a children's playhouse, you may substitute glass with plastic because of safety. The next one is, what can you combine? For example, smartphones now combine phone features with features of camera and a lot of other devices. The next thing, what can be added? For example, some cars now have built-in Wi-Fi. The next is, what can be modified, magnified, maximized, or minimized? So, for example, sunglasses could be reduced in size for small children. What could be put to a different use? You may have heard about people using coffee filters as face masks during the pandemic. The next one is, what could be eliminated? So, for example, again, if we go back to cars, cigarette lighters have been removed from cars, and that has given place for phone chargers, for example. And finally, what can be reversed, re-engineered, or rearranged? So what would happen if you reversed the product's production process? And a perfect example is what fast food restaurants have done. The traditional model is, in a restaurant, is that first you eat, then you pay. Fast food restaurants rearrange this typical model to you pay and then you eat. To round up our session today, because I think we're coming to an end of the session. So to round up it, I just want to say that the core of what we do in language schools is, of course, providing a learning path for our clients, which is an academic endeavor. But we mustn't forget that a language school is essentially a business. And yes, it's a business which provides educational services, but it's still a business. And so if we want to keep it being successful, we need to ensure that everything that we do on the academic side has very sound and solid business foundations. And in our industry, it means meeting or exceeding customer expectations in line with the ever-changing reality. And before I say thank you, very quick acknowledgement of the sources of images that I have used in my presentation. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. Let me just check if there's any questions that you would like to ask me. I don't see anything in the question and answer box. If you have any questions, can you put them into either the question and answer box, Q&A box, or into the chat? Thank you so much for all the thank yous that I have been receiving. That's lovely. I hope that you have found what I have been talking about useful on a number of levels. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, I can see that there are no questions that you would like to ask. Thank you very much for your kind words about my presentation. Okay, so if there are no questions, I would like to thank you all once again for your attention and for being here to listen to what I have to say about the future of language schools. And now I think we have a 15-minute break. Thank you very much.